which Thucydides talks about, having to do with the island of Milos, where the Athenians go, and they say to the folks on Milos, listen, you know, you folks need to subject yourselves to us. It's the rational thing for you to do. You know, we're taking over these islands, and we need to, for our defense, have them. And for dealing with Sparta, we need them. And the people in Milos say, no, you know, no, you can't have our island. You know, this is ours, and you can't do this. And the Athenians, again, are very rational. They say, well, you know, you have your choice. You give us the island, or we're going to slaughter you. And the Athenians, the Milesians say, you know, they're actually hoping the Spartans are going to help them out. And they say, no, you can't have it. And the Athenians move in and destroy Milos. In the wars with Carthage, Rome, you know, in the Third Punic War, in the middle of the 2nd century BC, you know, Cato in the Roman Senate is saying, you know, we got to get those Carthaginians. You know, the Mediterranean is really not big enough for the Romans and for the Carthaginians. You know, we really got to get them. And they start a war. And in the middle of this war, then, they destroy Carthage. But they not only destroy Carthage, they kill all the men. Again, we tend to hear about the destruction. We don't tend to hear that much about the killing. By the way, in ancient times, frequently women and children were spared, in part because they were economically so valuable. As they were brought into the households as slaves or as concubines, and the children were raised in these households. So it was the men in that case who suffered the slaying, and the young boys. But come up through time, it's almost always war that breeds genocide. In the case of the Armenians, you know, one could make the argument that the First World War, without the First World War, there wouldn't have been an Armenian genocide. You can make that argument. It's, you know, that's not an easy argument, but it's an argument that can and actually, I think, should be made. That war was crucial, you know, to the killing of the Armenians. And the same thing with the Second World War and the Jews. I mean, the mass murder of the Jews did not begin, as we know, until after Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941. Right? And that's when it began. And under cover of that war, and you can say, under cover of war, genocide happens. War breeds genocide. Where did the Cambodian genocide come from? It came from the Vietnam War. You know, we were bombing the hell out of Cambodia. And that disrupted that society in such a way, you know, that, the Cambodian Khmer Rouge formed itself into a powerful party to be able to take over that society and destroy its enemies. War breeds genocide. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, people will say, and it's partly true, that soldiers get used to killing. You know, that soldiers, after a while, you know, the blood doesn't mean very much to them, and they're willing to kill then in broader ways. And we know, for example, that the Wehrmacht was involved, of course, in the killing of the Jews, that the Turkish army, not just the Chetis and the informal groups were involved in the killing of the Armenians, that regular soldiers kill. And they kill also in genocidal situations. Korean War, Second World War. I mean, you know, these stories are still being told and still being revealed, but regular soldiers kill. It's also true in war that paramilitaries tend to do most of the damage. So we have a paramilitary, you know, police military, like the SS or like, the NKVD and others, who then carry out killing, you know, on behalf of the governments. And they're trained to kill often, and they kill with aplomb. And so you have this situation where people are used to the processes of killing, and they kill in war. There's a security argument in war, an interesting security argument that almost always comes up, which is, again, the Armenian case. You know, the Armenians are located in an area, you know, between us, meaning the Turks, and the Russians. We have to clear them out. We have to deport them. In the process of deportation, they're killed, right? But that's, you know, it's a security risk. They're a security risk. And these security risks then happen with the Armenians. I mean, it's claimed that the Jews are a security risk. Of course, they weren't. It's claimed often that peoples are security risks, that they're not. But the idea is they have to be eliminated. Okay, let's go to another theme, and that is of dehumanization. Again, a very common one that we all know about, one that needs to be mentioned. Dehumanization has a number of different aspects to it. I mean, one of the aspects of dehumanization we know as othering, and it's very clear what happens in that case is that people are separated, groups in society are separated from the main body of society, and in being separated, then they're then given characteristics which ostensibly make them others, which then make it possible for them to be killed and eliminated. This process repeats itself over and over again. You know, and again, you can go all the way back with this. You can go to the Spanish in the New World. What did the Spanish do in the New World? By the way, the Spanish, let's be clear about it, in the New World kill a lot of people. And there are arguments whether you could call it killing, because a lot of it is, of course, disease-ridden. They're bringing diseases with them that then cause the deaths of many of the natives and Indians in the region. But those natives and Indians in the region are also removed from their homes and their homelands, and they're put in situations that are dangerous to them, like in mines and forced labor. And then they get sick, and then they die because they're away from their regular way they would be cured, right? Or that they could get help, or that they could eat regularly. So I still call it killing. I mean, you don't have to call it killing if you don't want, but they do this. The other thing that the Spanish and the New World do is introduce into this history race. It's the beginning of race thinking. They're already talking about the Indians as others. They're not human. They're a different animal level, right? So there's the famous Valladolid disputation in the middle of the 16th century where de las Casas, who is one of the good guys, there are good guys in the genocide story, de las Casas gets up and he says, wait a minute, these Indians can be saved. You know, we can convert them, and then they can be like us. And his opponent, a man named Sepulveda, and they still have a big boulevard in Los Angeles named Sepulveda. Every time I go to Sepulveda Boulevard, I think they ought to get rid of that. I mean, this guy was no good. Anyway, Sepulveda said, no, they're animals. Not exactly animals. They're between animals and us. And he defined a whole level of othering of the Indians, which made it impossible then, even on conversion, for them to be considered equals. And the othering then goes all the way up. And we know what people do with othering. They also then create images of the other that are animal-like, insect-like, parasite-like. Right? I mean, you can see this again over and over again. It's not just with the Jews and the Nazis. It's also with the Armenians. It's with kulaks, you know, in the Soviet Union. I mean, the kulaks are portrayed as bugs that need to be squashed. Right? And people actually begin to think this. And this is a whole process of othering and a process of dehumanization. It doesn't begin as full-scale dehumanization and othering. It's a process that takes place, and that's why it's important. People talk about trying to stop genocide, to stop the process. I mean, a good example is with Goebbels, when he goes to the Łódź ghetto, and he goes into this ghetto, and he said, oh my God, look at those Jews. They're filthy. They're disease-ridden. They can't, you know, they pay no attention to each other. I mean, they publicly go to the bathroom and stuff like that. I mean, he's disgusted, right, by the Jews who are in the ghetto where he put them, or where the Nazis put them. And so they then force in other words, a dehumanization. And that dehumanization then becomes more and more complete until the Jews have no identity in the eyes of the Nazis except for people that need to be eliminated. And this happens too with the Armenians, by the way. Very similar thing happens to the Armenians, deported from their villages, sent across the deserts. They're then stripped of their clothes. They have nothing to eat. They're not given anything to drink. They turn into these emaciated, crazed people, and you get reports, what the Turks are saying, no, these are not humans. They might as well be eliminated. And this kind of thing we saw in Rwanda, and we see repeatedly in the case of genocide, this othering of people. To bring things home a little bit here, in Holland, the Trek Wars, in the Cape region with the San people, the so-called Bushmen, engaged in a very similar kind of process in the 17th century. Where the Bushmen are gradually dehumanized, gradually they're put into a category even worse than other Africans because they're not tameable. In other words, they're hunter-gatherers. And at that point then, the Trek Boers then go around in these groups of posses and gangs and simply eliminate them, kill them, as if they're nothing more than animals. And that's how they thought about them. Settler genocide, well, I'll talk about this in a second, but this point is more a point about othering and about creating categories of people that are it's necessary then to eliminate them. And not only is it necessary, it's their fault. Right? It's their fault. And you see in almost every case of genocide, the perpetrators saying, they did it. I mean, they're this, they're that, they're the third thing, and it's their fault that they have fallen to such a state of inhumanity that they have to be dealt with in this way. Okay, a third theme I want to talk about. I'm not going to get through them all. Is a theme of economic motivations. This has become actually very interesting in the historiography. There's a new historiography really that deals with economic motivations of genocide. We're finding more and more that this is not just a matter of hate, resentment, othering, dehumanization, racism, but is a matter of economic gain on the part of the people, who are doing the elimination. So, for example, with the Nazis, there's a whole, historiography now started with Gert Saleh. It's gone up to Adam Tooze, who have written about the ways in which, the Ministry of War Munitions, insisted that the Jews, be moved out of a certain area and their property taken so that they could use it for getting more munitions. In other words, they need money to fuel war. In order to fuel it, we're going to go after the Jews. Many of these people couldn't have cared less, the racial character of the Jews. What they were looking for was money. And they were looking for funding. There's a new historiography in the case of the Armenian genocide, which is very similar, looking for money, right? It wasn't that they were after the Armenians necessarily because of the security risk. They weren't necessarily out for them because they thought they were racially a problem or religiously a problem. They wanted their money. The government wanted their money to fight the war. And one way to do it was to get rid of the Armenians. And if you go back over the documents, you see there's a lot to this issue of economic motivations. Take settler genocide. I mean, that's all about land. It's all about land. And what's land about? It's about money. It's about income. And so we see repeatedly the same thing over and over again, whether it's California Indians, Tasmanian Aborigines, the Sand people in South Africa, wherever you go in Tierra del Fuego, what do they want? They want the land. I mean, in the case of the case study that I did for my book about the Yuki Indians who live in a beautiful area, or lived in a beautiful area, up around Mendocino, and so-called Round Valley, what had happened, again, the gold rush came to California, right? And with the gold rush, all kinds of people came into the region. San Francisco was booming. They needed food. And the ranchers said, boy, there's a lot we can do here. So the ranchers went up to Round Valley, and they basically started seizing the land from the Indians. The Indians fought back, or tried to fight back as best they could. They had no way to do so. And the ranchers then organized themselves into posses, paid for by the California state government, and then they killed the Indians. Right? In some cases, moved them to a reservation, but the reservation turned out to be, and frequently turns out to be, somebody here is a specialist on prison camps. We talked earlier. Anyway, these prison camps tend to be camps of elimination as well. People are eliminated in those territories. I mean, my hunch is, if you look deeper into the Soviet attack on kulaks, it's not just ideological. I haven't done this. I think there's a lot of work to be done on it, but I think you will find that economic motivations work there as well. All right, I think I have time maybe for a couple more, really fast. Cumulative radicalization. I want to talk about genocide under this theme of cumulative radicalization, which comes out of Holocaust studies mostly, as a process. Genocide is not something that takes place or doesn't. It's not a click on a light and turn off a light. It's a process. It's a process that has a beginning. It usually has a crescendo, sometimes, by the way, over a couple hundred years. In the case of the San people in South Africa, the crescendo really comes at the end of the 17th century, when the killing gets intense. But it goes on into the 19th century when the British come in to replace the Dutch in South Africa. And they continue the same process in slightly different ways. But nevertheless, it's a process. Cumulative radicalization means you start killing people, and you kill more, and you kill more. Like I said, there's a kind of crescendo. And then it fades away, but it also fades very slowly. I worked on the Armenian genocide, and what's clear there is that, it comes fairly quickly with the entry of Turkey into the First World War. And, the killing that comes in the summer, especially of 1915, really builds to a high point. But then it keeps going. 1916, 1917, 1918, into the Caucasus. You still see Turks killing Armenians. And by the way, you also see some Armenians killing some Turks. They're absolutely right about that. But the point is, it keeps going. And not only does it keep going, it spreads. That's an important part of this radicalization. It spreads from people to people. In other words, in the case, again, of the Holocaust, we know it starts with the handicapped. And then it goes to Jews, and then it goes to Poles, and sometimes Poles before Jews, depending on how you talk about the occupation of the General Gouvernement. But then it spreads to Gypsies, right? And Gypsies become a major object of Nazi elimination. And the Soviet POWs. And it keeps going. It doesn't stop. So in the Armenian case, you get this as well, right? It's Armenians, we call it the Armenian genocide, as we should, but you could also call it the genocide of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Because the Syriac Christians who live in the eastern part of Anatolia and also in parts of Iraq were also eliminated in a genocide that few people know about. The Greeks will claim, with some justification. I don't want to go into some of the arguments back and forth. It doesn't really matter on one level that there was a genocide of the Greeks, certainly of the Pontic Greeks, the Greeks who lived on the northern littoral of the southern littoral of the Black Sea, the northern part of Turkey. So it spreads from people to people. And the same thing, by the way, in Cambodia. They started killing Cambodians, and then they killed Vietnamese, and then they killed Ham, and then they just kept on killing, minority peoples. Soviet Union. One of the things I argue in my book, Stalin's Genocides, is that all of these killings that take place in the 30s are related to each other. Usually what happens is people separate them. But in fact, the killing, accelerates. And it accelerates into 1937, 38, and then we know it backs off because of the coming of the war. So it spreads, it accelerates, it works in these different ways. Okay, I think I'm just going to mention one, maybe I'll just mention the last three categories, conclude, and then we'll have some questions, right? And then I'm sure we'll have a chance to get to this. So let me just mention them briefly. One category is gratuitous violence. I mean, all I can say is, having studied genocide now since the mid-1990s, one of the things that still gets me, and I still can't get over, is that it's not just killing. It's brutality, it's maiming, it's rape, it's, the worst kind of abusing of other human beings. So there's nothing clean about genocide. I mean, even the Nazis, I think a lot of our images of the clean, concentration camps, I think that's been destroyed pretty well. There's nothing clean about it. It's the worst dehumanizing thing that you can imagine. Again, I was talking to Nancy, the anniversary of the Babi Yar massacre. I went to Kiev a year and a half ago now. And one of the things that really got me, and it just continues to get me, was the dehumanization of the people and the brutalization of the people before then lining them up and massacring them. Right? In other words, it's not just killing people. It's much more than that. And that is something I think that is very hard for the human consciousness to try to absorb. Okay, I'm not going to, rape and gender was another category. I'm not going to talk about that. Long-term causes and short-term ones, it's hard to separate. I just want to point out that it's hard to separate the longue durée from the short, immediate causes. What caused the Armenian genocide? Well, on one level, you could say it was the outbreak of the First World War and the fact that Armenians were seen as enemies of the Turkish government. But on the other hand, there are long-term causes for, the breakdown of the Millet system, whereby the Armenians were more or less autonomous within the Ottoman Empire. You could say the same thing about the Jews in Germany, who were assimilated, participating in this society, and all of a sudden it came to an end. You could say the same thing about Yugoslavia. What triggers that genocide, in the middle of the 90s? What's the trigger? Or is it long-term? Some people say, I could see it coming, from the 60s and 70s. Well, I sure couldn't. And so the question is then, how do you balance these things? And I find it very difficult. Okay, let me just conclude by saying two things. I've tested your patience already, so let me wrap up. The first thing is genocide. If you take this model that I've sort of given you, or take this package that I've thrown at you, genocide is part of human history. Genocide is part of human history. I mean, we started with that, we're going to end with that. It's part of us. It's part of our societies, all of our societies. No one is exempt. No society is exempt, right? And as part of all of us, then we're all responsible in some ways. Not only are we all responsible, but we're all potentially culpable. I mean, I've seen people say, how do people say that? Well, I'll say it. I think we're all potentially perpetrators. Put in these situations, you see so many of them in different countries, in different societies, in different ways. Everyone is capable of this kind of behavior. It's part of who we are as human societies. Okay, that's first of all. Second of all, that's a pretty depressing thought. So second of all, I want to end on an optimistic one. I don't know if any of you have read Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Have anybody read that? I hope you've read that. If you haven't, you should. I was skeptical of this book in the beginning. What it does is it tries to trace statistically the amount of killing in various forms, homicides, rapes, genocides, over the centuries. He assumes it's taken place over the centuries. And he does actually, I think, in the end I was won over generally to his argument. He does a brilliant job reconstructing this data and demonstrating these data and demonstrating that things are actually getting better. If you think about it, it makes sense. It makes sense, right? I mean, countries are becoming more stable. Governments are becoming more concerned about their citizens' welfare. There's less, if you were a citizen in 17th century, wherever, you would be subject to homicide or killing or all kinds of terrible things, destruction or war. Your lifespan would be very short, and you would be damn lucky to make it to be as old as I am, or you are, right? So he takes all this data and he shows that the incidence of genocide is actually going down. We had a real bad mid-century, mid-20th century, right? With the war and the Holocaust. If you include the Armenian events of the First World War, that was really bad. And stuff has not been going great recently. But if you take all this together, the norms are shifting. Slowly, but surely they're shifting. People are ready, to do something about this. It's a very important move on the part of the international system that sovereignty is no longer considered an excuse for genocide. You take something like World War I and the American foreign minister at that time, Secretary of State Lansing, said there's nothing we can do about the Armenian genocide because it's taking part inside Turkey. We recognize them as a legitimate, inside the Ottoman Empire. We recognize them as a legitimate government. We can protest, but there's nothing to be done, period. That's changed. Not that we're doing all that much, but it's still the norms have changed. And the changing norms then have a way of changing the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this amazing lecture, and I can say rather than testing our patience, you could have heard a pin drop during this lecture. Also, thank you for ending on a more optimistic note, because this is quite a grim tale, and we're all part of it. I know that there are a lot of questions. I also know that there were some students who saved their questions, or we didn't get to them this morning, so I'd like to turn the floor over to you, and please state your name and not extremely long questions, please.
You have to speak loudly and clearly because my hearing is not very
Hi, I'm Ethan Mark. I teach history actually at Leiden University. I was wondering where you fit the Atlantic slave trade and that whole history, the centuries of slavery, into this model, or not?
That's a really, everybody heard it, right? Okay, that's a great question, and it's like those questions that always used to come to me, that I couldn't answer. My gut feeling, not being an expert on the slave trade, is that is not genocide. In other words, the way I think about, and I'm going to, just use myself as an example, not try to objectify this in any way, but just say, the way I think about what we would call in general atrocity crimes is that there are now three major ones, genocide, which I consider the crime of crimes. Not everyone agrees, but I think it's the crime of crimes. Crimes against humanity and war crimes. It would seem to me that the slave trade fits well within crimes against humanity. People are taken from their homes, sometimes murdered, beaten, abused, and sent to places they don't want to be, and sometimes killed. So that strikes me as a very good example. Slavery, in fact, is mentioned in the ICC forced slavery. I can't remember the exact language they use, but in the new ICC language of the International Criminal Court, slavery and forced something. I can't remember whether